Poverty and development, growing the economy, are important foci in international political economy studies. Since all countries must generate wealth for their survival, and since countries are increasingly interconnected to each other through trade, policymakers and international organizations have undertaken a massive development effort around the globe. That being said, development of former colonies has been extremely uneven and exploitative, as others have already referenced. And this is not always a good thing for international peace, especially as Barbieri pointed out, when trade is unequal and it is very important trade, this might exacerbate inequalities as well as tensions. The role of government in the economy is another controversial topic inside and outside of the United States. But that role becomes increasingly hazy once international economic factors, including much that domestic governments cannot or will not control, get factored in. Like before, we see international studies begin to take stock of the range of actors influencing political outcomes. In this case, the actors include international organizations, state governments, and multi or transnational corporations. And we look at their role not only in influencing international trade and policy, but in addressing or exacerbating development problems. The manner in which corporations engage in developmental and justice issues across the globe is the topic of this discussion. After decades of exponential growth at the expense of low-paid workers who received jobs lost to deindustrializing countries, and especially after the 1999 Battle for Seattle at the World Trade Organization Summit, corporations undertook a range of actions to repair their image and, in some cases, bolster workers' wages and their rights in their companies. The self-regulating that corporations began in the late 1990s has been termed corporate social responsibility, and this graphic displays a sample of programs and initiatives that companies, especially those in the textile manufacturing sector, have taken. These include answers to environmental concerns as well as labor rights. The textile sector is responsible for some of the harshest working conditions in developing countries, along with being one of the world's top polluters. CSR, or corporate social responsibility, has become a major focus not only for corporate managers, but also for development practitioners within the NGO community and within development agencies. Development NGOs have been critical of voluntary initiatives undertaken in the corporate sector, while official development agencies take a very positive view of this development. UK's Department for International Development states that by following socially responsible practices, the growth generated by the private sector will be more inclusive, equitable, and poverty reducing. However, the concept of CSR is not very well developed, and there are variations in how corporations understand their obligations. Corporations are large drivers of wealth, but the question over the relationship between business and society has been long running. As the drivers of employment, they hold disproportionate power over the economy, and it tends to be the case that they gain disproportionate power over legislation related to their activities as well. From the rate of taxes paid by corporations to wage inequalities and stagnation, the question about whether employers can essentially set their own standards for how they operate is a historically controversial question in the United States. But it is also important in other places around the world. The United States has embraced free market economics, but there have also been periods of regulation of companies to protect against predatory behavior among corporations. The first wave of regulations occurred with the consolidation of large corporations in the late 19th century, which led to antitrust laws and the regulations of utilities. Demands that corporate power be reined in led major U.S. companies to emphasize corporate responsibility to demonstrate that corporations did not need excessive regulation by government. The Great Depression in the 1930s contributed to a second wave of regulation as part of Roosevelt's New Deal and post-war Europe's nationalization and regulation of utilities and healthcare. The proposed International Trade Organization's draft charter, signed in 1948, included measures that addressed international investment, employment standards, and restrictive business practices, but it was never ratified by the United States. The third wave of regulations occurred in the 60s and 70s and included consumer and environmental protection. During this time, U.S. companies' activities abroad became suspect after various scandals like the ITT scandal in Chile, where it was revealed that the U.S. company had been involved in attempting to overthrow the democratically elected Popular Unity government led by Salvador Allende in the 1970s. A number of bribery cases also resulted in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977. The developing world also saw increased efforts to regulate the activities of foreign investors. The UN also turned its attention to establishing codes of conduct for activities of transnational corporations. These codes were seen as supporting the efforts of developing countries to regulate TNCs at the national level because they were seen as a threat to the sovereignty of small, poor states. Corporations and northern governments resisted global attempts at regulation of TNCs, proposing self regulation as an alternative. The International Chamber of Commerce, representing major transnational corporations, launched its Guidelines for International Investment in 1972. A large number of U.S. companies adopted codes of conduct. These paid attention to curtailing questionable payments during the 1970s. The 1980s saw a significant shift away from state intervention in both developed and developing countries. The increased mobility of capital enabled TNCs to exploit regulatory differences between states by relocating their production facilities in countries with more favorable regimes. This is a phenomenon referred to as regulatory arbitrage. These trends were reflected in developing country policies towards TNCs, which shifted dramatically from regulation to intense competition in order to attract FDI, or foreign direct investment. This competition has been referred to as the race to the bottom, where poor countries lower regulations to the point where worker and environmental safety, as well as financial market stability, are sacrificed. Optimism about neoliberal policies in both the South and the North began to fade in the 1990s, and corporations attracted criticism for their global environmental and labor practices. The growth of global value chains, where Northern buyers control a web of suppliers in the South, led to calls to take responsibility not only for aspects like quality, but for working conditions and environmental protection. At the same time, the increased significance of brands and corporate reputation made leading companies particularly vulnerable to bad publicity. Many firms sourcing consumer goods from developing countries drew particular attention during the year of the sweatshop in 95 and 96, when Gap, Kathy Lee Gifford, Levi Strauss, and others' treatment of sweatshop laborers came under harsh scrutiny. These companies went on to adopt corporate social responsibility, and the same time period saw executive industries like Shell take on CSR as a response to its operation in the Niger Delta, where protesting indigenous people were killed by private security teams. The 1990s saw CSR coming largely from the North, where trade unions, development NGOs, human rights organizations, and environmental groups have all called for greater social responsibility. The fact that CSR is driven largely by the industry itself has important implications for which issues are at the forefront of CSR, and they tend to concern themselves with environmental impacts, working conditions, and human rights. Companies are concerned largely with the potential damage to their reputations that may accrue as a result of media exposure of corporate malpractice. These priorities paint CSR in negative terms, emphasizing things companies should not do, like employing child labor, rather than seeking positive development outcomes like eradicating poverty. The current CSR agenda is important for what it does not address. Corporate practices like transfer pricing, tax avoidance, or the abuse of market power are not part of the CSR mainstream, and it has not explicitly dealt with the poverty impacts of business activities. For instance, despite the growth of ethical funds in recent years, no fund management company includes impact on poverty as a specific criterion in assessing company performance. Even the UN Global Compact does not explicitly refer to key development concerns such as poverty reduction or equity. However, many non-governmental organizations argue that social dimensions are increasingly important and that economic growth is only one measure of development. While corporate social responsibility was initially a corporate initiative adopted by individual companies and their organizations, in the late 1990s it began to be taken up by international organizations like the World Bank and the UN and national development cooperation agencies as well. Over the past quarter century, these organizations have made attempts to incorporate social dimensions of development like hunger, primary education, gender equality, improving health outcomes, and others. These goals are expressed in the Millennium Development Goals, which propose to meet certain benchmarks in lowering poverty between 1990 and 2015. At the same time, development agencies have promoted less active roles of states and government, as is illustrated by the popularity of the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus emphasized liberalization, deregulation, and a reduced role of the state in developing economies, and its preference for the private sector having a greater role in the economy. The shift was also reflected in the flows of capital to developing countries, where foreign direct investment is running at 3 times the level of official development assistance. But by the late 1990s, cracks appeared in the Washington Consensus, and there was growing awareness that the market alone was not sufficient to bring about development. With multiple market failures in developing countries, critiques began to emerge. Firms driven by short-term financial profitability may not make long-term investments necessary to promote human development or benefit the poor. Corporations have repeatedly argued that governments should not be invested in development, and policy has largely followed suit, so it is questionable if these goals can even be met under this structure. This graph depicts the increases in foreign direct investment in the global economy since 1970. One of the most convincing measures of globalization is the amount of investments being moved around in the global financial market. As you see, the developed countries continue to draw the largest amounts of FDI and experience the sharpest increases as well as decreases over the years, particularly since the 2000s. The role of FDI is important to relate. FDI has been promoted as an important driver of wealth and a solid policy measure to address poverty. There are 3 main channels of influence of FDI: the enterprise channel, the distribution channel, and the government revenue channel. This section more or less points out the pros and cons of each for addressing poverty. The enterprise channel may or may not ease poverty, since FDI may support businesses that rely on skilled or unskilled labor, and unskilled labor does not offer much long-term middle-class support. In addition, in developing countries, FDI is often concentrated in economic protection zones, or EPZs, special areas of the state that house and protect garment factories and other low-skilled labor industries. Very rarely does this type of investment truly filter throughout the less developed areas of these states. The distribution channel has implications for poverty as well. In the first place, the poor are seen as benefiting from development as consumers, as companies expand their markets to sell products to poor people, which leaves questions as to whether this solves their poverty problem. Improving access to many people can reduce the cost of a service, but the common practice is to see investors increase prices, not drop them. In addition, some products may be problematic if marketed toward the poor, from increased packaging and pollution due to selling smaller quantities of items to infringing on a part of the market that poor people informally fill. An example of this is given in the article where incense rollers in India were underbid by large companies using machine-rolled incense at much cheaper prices. The government revenue channel is also important. Foreign investors contribute to government tax revenues, which may be then used for anti-poverty measures, particularly in extractive industries. But this depends on the extent to which the state is able to levy taxes on foreign capital and uses made of any tax revenues. Both of these options are often discouraged by development agencies under the Washington Consensus. A number of factors limit revenue gains from FDI. Competition to attract FDI means that governments offer tax holidays to investors, and this is especially true in economic protection zones where taxes and regulations are minimized. Transnational corporations are well placed to minimize their global tax burden by putting profits in tax havens, using various forms of transfer pricing to reduce profits that they must declare in high tax jurisdictions. The largest companies devote considerable resources to ensuring that they pay as little tax as possible. CSR operates off of assumptions of what qualifies as good business sense. According to its proponents, corporate social responsibility works because businesses that are not responsible will not see benefits, and consumers, laborers, and suppliers will work to shun these businesses. The author argues that more emphasis on corporations' involvement in the enterprise channel could help improve corporations' record of easing poverty. For example, corporations can behave as job creators in developing countries, but they must offer higher pay and better conditions. But this can only happen through greater coordination between firms than we see today. Without coordination, firms have an incentive to pay less to their workers and protect the environment less in order to increase their profits. In addition, CSR is not sufficient because it does nothing to target the poor, since its focus is on generating wealth at the firm level, and its appeals are often about generating wealth overall. With 30 years of evidence, the current structure seems to provide for more inequality between incomes than it does the eradication of poverty. The authors doubt the distribution channel's ability to eliminate poverty through CSR, largely due to the fact that most of the markets for goods created in the South are located in the North. While firms do bring the potential for growing infrastructure in a developing country, they often do not invest heavily in long-term commitments and so do not do the types of improvements to an area like roads, telephones, electricity, schools, and hospitals that are potential sources of startup aid to get an economy going. Another sector that has a major impact on the poor is the pharmaceutical industry. The high cost of drugs puts them out of reach for most poor households, and recent reductions in prices could be regarded as an example of pro-poor corporate social responsibility. But in practice, this development has not been driven by corporate social responsibility, but rather by the growth of competition from generic products, increased funds made available by donors, and companies' loss of public support in the face of NGO pressure. However, a pro-poor CSR strategy really could involve a deliberate effort to make a company's products available to the poor at a discount. But as currently practiced, there is minimal impact on the poor. The focus on labor and environment means corporate social responsibility pays little attention to the price strategies of transnational corporations. Finally, government revenue is an area where massive improvement potentially lies. CSR rarely addresses tax avoidance by corporations. The authors argue that the payment of taxes should be seen as a fundamental aspect of corporate citizenship. Corporate social responsibility also has not made many strides toward addressing the amount of bribery, corruption, and unethical deals made behind closed doors between corporations and government officials. The authors conclude that there are a number of reasons for doubting that CSR will make growth more inclusive and equitable, thereby reducing poverty. Since CSR initiatives do not aim to reduce poverty but focus instead on labor and environmental issues, corporate social responsibility is unlikely to have a significant impact on reducing poverty in the South.